Well, I'm delighted to be back in Salzburg and at the Kunstverein. I'm very grateful to my friend and indeed fellow countryman, Seamus Illy, and the secretary to the Institute, Simone Geisberger, for inviting me and arranging everything so efficiently. I've been asked to speak about this remarkably cheap and extraordinarily attractive book called Materialism I wrote. And indeed I'll be very happy to sign copies for you later on, if you want. But I don't, the book contains some brilliant remarks on Karl Marx and Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, and it even has a scintillating chapter called Do Badgers Have Souls? But I won't reveal the answer to you, I won't spoil your enjoyment of the chapter. But I don't actually want to talk so much about that at the moment. I don't want to talk about the historical materialist Marx. I want to talk about the material girl Madonna a little bit. I don't know if it's widely known, though I keep telling people this, so maybe you have, but I once slept in Madonna's bed. I would love to give you a record of the pillow talk, except that she wasn't there, of course, nor had she been there for a good 10 years. Still, I felt very privileged and honoured. It might have been even better that she wasn't there, because she might have kicked me out, if she had been. But I'm intrigued by the way that the material girl living in the material world is at the same time a sort of great fan of so-called spirituality, what I might call Hollywood spirituality, sort of Kabbalah and Zen and Torah and theosophy and crystals and so-called Scientology. Even the name Scientology is pretty stupid, let alone the people, since it means the knowledge of knowledge. They don't even have a kind of coherent name to their organization. Why is it, though, that people, there is this, as it were, Hollywood spirituality? Well, why are material girls like Madonna so fascinated by Kabbalah and so on? Well, I think it's because the spiritual, in this rather perverted and distorted meaning of the term, is a refuge, isn't it, from everything material about it. People who have too many, butlers and swimming pools and bank accounts and so on, need some place, some oasis, some place of refuge, and that they call spirituality. Yes? And the point about it is that it's absolutely otherworldly. It has nothing to do with your agents and recording comrades and bank managers and so on. It's a world apart. And I don't think you could therefore find a greater contrast between this bogus, this phony idea of spirituality, which is the exact antithesis of the material, and the Judeo-Christian tradition, for which that antithesis doesn't really exist. In the Hebrew scriptures, usually rather anti-Semitically known as the Old Testament, as to say that which has been definitively set aside, Yahweh keeps trying to persuade his pathologically religious people that he isn't a religious God of any kind. He's not a God to make a graven image of, because the only graven image of him is human beings, is flesh and blood, it's people, men and women. But his people insist perversely on seeing him as a religious God, because they want, for one thing, to be punished and chastised and relieved, therefore, of their guilt. And that's one thing that a God can do for you. So if you're going to have a God at all, you might as well have some big nasty bastard of a God, wielding a big stick, some patriarch or superego of a god, rather than some sort of limp-wristed, guardian reading kind of god. I mean, the point of a god is precisely, but a god of this idolatrous kind is precisely to punish you. And why do you want to be punished? Well, to be purged of your guilt, of course, to begin with, but also because it's very gratifying to be punished, chronic masochists that we are. But then being gratified by being purged of one's guilt simply leads you to more guilt, and that to more punishment, and that to more gratification, and that whole lethal syndrome, which Freud might call the superego or the death drive, is known to St. Paul as the law. That is what Paul means by the law, which he says is cursed. There is no salvation in it at all. You simply tread the same dreary circle of the punitive and the guilty and the gratifying and so on. So that's the kind of God that the Jews on the whole in the Hebrew Scriptures want, and the kind of God that Yahweh continually refuses to be. I hate your burnt offerings, Isaiah makes him say. Your incense stinks in my nostrils. Forget about your religion. What are you doing about protecting the widows and the orphans? What are you doing about shielding the poor from the violence of the rich? What are you doing about comforting the afflicted and visiting the imprisoned and feeding the hungry? When you do that, then, he says, you will know who I am. You will know what kind of non-God I am. You will know that when you see the poor being filled with good things, as Mary sings in Luke's Gospel, which are words which we think may be a revolutionary zealot chant, incidentally, the anti-imperial force against the Romans. When you see the poor being filled with good things and the rich sent empty away, and all that is spirituality. All very material, all very practical, and in implication, all very political as well. I think that Judeo-Christian tradition challenges the whole phony idea of the spiritual as otherworldly in some way, as a refuge from or compensation for, an excessively material kind of reality. It's also interesting that in the so-called New Testament, also I think an anti-Semitic title, nevertheless, in the New Testament, it's striking how utterly impersonal love is presented as. Love is nothing personal. I mean, despite the debased Western, fairly recent tradition of the erotic and romantic and sentimental and interpersonal and the whole postmodern fetishism of sexuality. There's almost nothing about sexuality in the Gospel. Jesus is very laid back about it. But despite all that, the ethic of love in the Scriptures directly challenges that kind of degenerate notion, of love as some kind of personal or interpersonal coziness. It doesn't matter whether you know the person whose place you take in the queue for the gas chambers. It doesn't matter at all. The injunction isn't to love everybody in some sort of kind of universal sentiment. What would that mean? It's to love any old body, regardless of who they are, regardless also of their gender and ethnicity, yes, which poses a certain critique as well to postmodern culture, to love them for their sheer humanity. The paradigm of love for the so-called New Testament is not love of friends, of course. Anybody can love a friend, there's no great merit in that. It's love of enemies and strangers, because there's no kind of cozy glow or erotic thrill or sexual fulfillment at all involved in what it sees as the most authentic kind of love. The only problem, of course, being, as far as the New Testament is concerned, that if you do manage to love in that way, then they'll kill you. If you don't love, you're dead, and if you do, they'll kill you. There's the very comforting and consoling news that the gospel has to bring. Marx, when Marx began to talk about materialism, he knew, I think, that he was doing something original with the concept. He was implicitly challenging the various forms of mechanical materialism, which were much philosophically in vogue at his time, and he was doing something in a sense very simple for us now, but which wasn't then, which was to start thinking from the standpoint of men and women as practical, corporeal, material agents. Not to begin, as with empiricism, for example, from the subject as passive or receptive, but actually to begin with a sense of agency, to think everything through again, as it were, politically and socially, this time thinking in terms of human beings as corporeal agents. On this theory, we think as we do because of the kind of animals that we are. Yes? For example, our thinking is discursive in the sense of going on, unfolding in time, because that's what our experience is like. That's how our senses, as it were, are organized. Human rationality is an animal rationality. It's a kind of rationality appropriate only to a fleshly body. And believe it or not, one of the most insistent proponents of that viewpoint was perhaps the greatest theologian after St. Paul and St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas taught that we were animals all the way down, not just down, as it were, from the neck down, but all the way down. And that, for Aquinas, was in no way incompatible with seeing people as, quotes, spiritual, or even, if you like, seeing them as having a soul, though the language of having a soul is the wrong kind of language game, as Wittgenstein might say. You don't have a soul in the way that you have a liver, or a pancreas. It's not some kind of spectral organ or ghostly lung that might be lurking 2 inches from your left armpit. We use a language which inevitably reifies our idea of spirituality when we talk like that. But for this kind of tradition, which includes Marx's great mentor, Aristotle, though Marx is a kind of closet Aristotelian. He doesn't really come out of the Aristotelian closet. He's very indebted to Aristotle, but he doesn't say very much about him. But for that tradition, which includes Aquinas, the reason why we're cognitive beings is because we're carnal ones, or fleshly ones. Because only with a needy creature like ourselves, a creature who is somehow lacking, who is not self-complete, who is not autonomous, has to labour, has to produce. And in order to labour in any fulfilling and complex and extended way, we have to think. So we are cognitive because of the nature of our bodies. And long before we come to think, of course, we are already practically and emotionally bound up with the world, so that our thought is bound to take place within that kind of framework. The kind of thinking that represses the carnality of thought is known as philosophy. Yes? The kind of thinking that, generally speaking, insists on the autonomy of thought, which is one reason why, of course, most of the finest philosophers are also anti-philosophers. Marx himself, Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Adorno, Derrida, and so on, a whole tradition of anti-philosophers. Thomas Aquinas, to go back to him, probably the greatest theologian the church ever produced, thought that identity was corporeal. In other words, what makes you you, for Aquinas, isn't something called the soul, It's a particular kind of lump of matter you happen to be. You know, we're all, whatever else we are, we're all lumps of natural matter, some lumpier than others perhaps, and whatever more sexy and glamorous things we can get up to, we have to get up to within an acknowledgement of that finitude and that frailty. Yes? I'll say more about that in a moment. Anything then that doesn't involve my body doesn't involve me. This is the idea of identity as corporeal. If I speak to you on the phone, I'm not physically present to you because we're not sharing the same spatial coordinates, but I'm certainly bodily present to you as you are to me. Rearrange this little stand here. So for Aquinas, what makes us ourselves, what makes you, you, and me, is the distinctive lump of matter that we happen to be, yes? It's not something called the soul, though Aquinas believes in the soul, but the soul is something generic. The soul for him is something that all human beings share. So there's a thing called a human soul, but there's also a thing called, if you like, a squirrel soul. You know, squirrels have souls as well. I don't want to get too sentimental and weedy about them, you know, and very fine little creatures in their own way, and certainly very good little chaps, you know. But for Aquinas would certainly say that squirrels have a soul. Why? Because they have something mystic and elusive and spiritual inside them. A squirrel's secretly praying or fasting. They practice ascetic, monastic lives. No. Because all that Aquinas has with his great mentor Aristotle really means by a soul is what he would call the form of the body. This particular lump of matter is somehow impregnated with or expressive of a particular mode of organization, which in the case of humans is different from badgers and squirrels. They too have souls in the sense that they're lumps of matter which are significantly organized and self-organizing, yes. But the squirrel soul, most of us don't have souls as squirrels, you know. Nor, I think, can the souls cross over from one to the other. Wittgenstein says in the investigation that if you want an image of the soul, look at the body. He means look at the body in action, not look at the corpse. In fact, Aquinas doesn't actually, interestingly, regard a corpse as a body. He won't speak about a dead body, because that for him would be a contradiction in terms. Bodies just are organized, significant, self-transformative entities. So he speaks, as we ourselves sometimes do, of the remains of a body. Yes? Aquinas believes in the soul, but he doesn't think it's something, as it were, added to, tacked onto the body. A kind of, you know, like, as I say, like a kind of spectral liver, or, you know, ghostly kidney. He would, for example, Aquinas would have believed in the disembodied soul of Michael Jackson, had he known about Michael Jackson, which he was mercifully spared from. But he wouldn't have thought that the disembodied soul of Michael Jackson was Michael Jackson. He certainly wouldn't have thought that. Michael Jackson, for him, means a certain living, corporeal entity whose remains still hang around the place somewhere. On this theory, if you like, the soul, one can't avoid this language which treats it as a kind of thing. The soul is present in the body as a meaning is present in a word. The body is a signifier, is an expressive sign. It's intrinsically, its flesh is intrinsically expressive meaning in the way that pieces of language or texts are. That's not to say, of course, that the body is always transparent, that the meaning is always perfectly legible or clear. We might have to decipher the meaning of somebody's action, or indeed, more importantly, the meanings of our own actions, because one sure thing we've learned from late modernity is that we're not transparent to ourselves. We might have to decipher that, but nevertheless, the meaning is fleshed out in the way the body moves and has its being. And soul language, possibly also mind language. It just occurred to me as I was flying over from Ireland yesterday that somebody was going to ask me about the difference between soul and mind. Please don't do that, because I have no idea. Maybe somebody else can provide that information. Some of what I say about soul could apply, in fact, to the mind as well, but perhaps not all of it. Soul language just is a way of describing a particular kind of body. That's to say, a body which is expressive, relational, communicative, transformative, self-organizing, signifying. It's a way of marking off, if you like, that kind of body from, this glass of water here, which happens not to have those characteristics. And what we call mind just is a way of participating in a material form of life along with other bodies of our kind. Those bodies participate together, construct together a form of life, and what we call mind, which we think of very often in a rather distorting tradition of something private and internal, is actually the way we take part in that material activity. Wittgenstein once professed himself with a certain faux naivete, perhaps, as puzzled by the way that people talked about the external world. Philosophers were always going on about the external world. He said he didn't understand, couldn't understand what it was meant by the external world. I suppose he might have had in mind external to what? Not to us. The world isn't something out there, it's something we're in the midst of, that we're part of. Maybe that's what he had in mind. He also, this is quite irrelevant what I've just been saying, but why not? At one point he says, love is not a feeling. What on earth does he mean by that? Should he just not just got out a bit more, perhaps, got around the place a bit more? No, I think he meant love isn't a feeling in the way that pain is a feeling. So that, for example, you could say, couldn't you, or rather, you could say that was pain, though it only lasted for 10 seconds, but you couldn't say that was love, though it only lasted for 10 seconds. Why not? Because love isn't a sensation, it's a disposition, it's a way of behaving, it's a way of being, it's discursive, and so on. It's not an isolable feeling in that sense. So on this materialist theory, human bodies, or not only animal bodies really, are articulate matter. They are stuff that signifies something. But here's the problem. The problem is that if you have a high level of signification, which is to say, if you're a linguistic animal, and there are various contradictions about being a linguistic animal, but that's another story. If you're a linguistic animal, then you can, that's to say, you live in a conceptual world, and mean by a linguistic animal one who lives in a world of meaning. That strange and mysterious thing that we don't really understand. But if you live in a world of meaning, if you're a linguistic animal, then you have an almost indefinite capacity to extend your body outwards. Yes? And that we call civilization, or human society. Everything that we have around us, cultural centres and burger bars and cinemas and swimming pools and parliaments and so on, are extensions of our body. Why? Because we're able to be as productive as we are, precisely because we have the conceptual means to reach far beyond our immediate sensory experience. A lot of the other animals, some of them are very clever, of course, but a lot of the other animals relate to their environment pretty directly by their bodies. or with a minimum of mediation. But because we are linguistic beings, we're always in danger of developing too fast, too much, overreaching ourselves and bringing ourselves to nothing. And that is one of the classical rhythms of what we call tragedy. As far as we know, squirrels and badgers are not building cruise missiles. I mean, they may be doing it secretively, at night when nobody can see them, or when we're looking in the other direction. They might be just putting together it, and then suddenly, when we look at them, they raise their paws and say, "Oh, nothing, it's all right." But probably not. Why not? As Wittgenstein says, why a dog can be expecting his master to return, but he can't be expecting him to return at 3:16 next Wednesday. Why not, says Wittgenstein? Is it because he does not have language? Implying the answer, yes, that's the reason. Similarly with squirrels and so on. I don't want to become patronising to these nice little chaps, but it's amazing the kind of things they just can't do that we can. We can blow ourselves up, for example. They can't even rise to the level. They can't rise to the level of creating cruise missiles. They don't have the paws for it, for a start. I mean, what a barren life they must lead. In other words, the point being that animals who don't have those kinds of creative conceptual capacities that we have, their life is maybe slightly boring, looked at from the outside, but it's safe. It's safe. The animal which has history lives in constant danger. A life that is precarious and fragile and turbulent, as I say, constantly in danger of overreaching itself. Yeah? And that, of course, is traditionally known as the fall. The fall. We are the fallen creature. The only mistake to make about the fall is to think that it's a fall down. It's not. It's a fall up. It's a fall up from the innocent animality of our fellow creatures, beasts, into the frightening and exhilarating dimension of language, history, consciousness, and so on. Yes, which releases powers and capacities which are undreamt of otherwise, but by the same token, the flip side of that narrative is that those powers and capacities allow us to wound and hurt and destroy and exploit and oppress one another in the way that, as far as we can see, goldfish don't, unless again they're being very quiet about it, perhaps because they're guilty. So the fall is perfectly real. There's nothing mythological about the fall. It's just that it was up rather than down, and it was a very long process rather than just the eating of an apple. Yes, it wasn't just a single moment or event. And all of that, I think, has, if you like, that kind of materialism, those ways of describing human beings, have ethico-political implications. There's a problem here about how you move, as they say, from fact to value, to the nature of the human species, to certain ethical and political values. But because we're material and fragile and vulnerable and so on, for one thing, we're in need of an unnaturally prolonged period of care when we're very small, when we're infants. Otherwise, we will quickly die. That's not the case with most of our fellow animals. They just, they're born and they stagger to their feet and lick themselves down and gallop off shakily into the middle distance. We can't do that. And as far as Freud is concerned, all of our problems begin from that unnaturally protracted period of utter dependency on other bodies, the bodies around us, in the traffic between the infant, which means the speechless one, the one who has not yet acceded to language, in the traffic between its body and the bodies that both produce and surround it. For one thing, the seeds, for Freud, the seeds of morality are laid, Freud says that morality begins in the infant's speechless gratitude to its carers, which you can kind of articulate, but also, of course, the seeds of neurosis and potentially psychosis as well. All of that has a political implication in the sense that it strikes at the greatest of bourgeois myths, namely the myth of human autonomy. Its refusal of the fact that we are, above all, radically dependent creatures, and that whatever autonomy or self-determination we can negotiate for ourselves has to go on within that context of dependency and finitude. And it's that which is anathema to the Orange Lord, Donald Trump, and his kind. Because, of course, the American myth, the great, many American myths, but one of the greatest, is, of course, is not only that human beings are potentially infinite. Only in America will you hear the ludicrous mantra, I can do anything I want if I put my mind to it. Or become a banana. Or the idea of, that the peak of achievement is to be entirely self-dependent, as Shakespeare's, as somebody says about Coriolanus in Shakespeare, as if a man were author of himself and knew no other kin. Shakespeare lived on the threshold of this deadly ethic, being, as it were, ushered in, possessive individualism, if you like. So, in that sense, I think, there's a way in which perhaps one can get from a certain materialist view of humanity to the brilliant idea of socialism. But that's partly another story. Am I okay just for another five minutes, James? Let me just say this, which is not very much related to what I just said, but continuity is not everything. Speaking of political ethics, or the political and ethical, which, of course, for Aristotle are sides of the same coin, it's again part of a bourgeois mistake to think ethics is about something called the personal life and politics about the public life. Aristotle would see no such distinction, and neither would Aquinas. But it's part, and Marx inherits that tradition through Hegel, really. But it involves an interesting kind of ethics, which, if you wanted to say, what is Marxist ethics? I think you would have to say the fullest and richest possible realization of the powers and capacities of each individual. In other words, socialism would mean simply whatever material or institutional conditions, and you can argue over that till kingdom come, would allow that to happen. Or, as he puts it more pithily in the Communist Manifesto, the most single influential document in 19th century Europe, the free development of each is the condition of the free development of all. Right? Now, what's important, what distinguishes that from a classical liberal ethics? Well, the fact that this self-realization has to be done reciprocally. Has to say, my self-realization has to go on in and through and in terms of yours. Yeah? Now, when we talk about that interpersonally, of two people, each of whose self-development goes on in that way, that's what we call love. That's what we call love in interpersonal terms, right? And what Marx is really talking about, he doesn't use these phrases, though various of his commentators have, is what you might call political love. In other words, what would be the equivalent of that at the level of the whole society? Would, for example, the kind of self-governing cooperatives, which Marx seems to think of as the economic unit of socialism, in some way answer to that? But that ethics has a problem, as every ethics does. It has several problems, but let me just end by mentioning one. It tends to assume that our powers and capacities are inherently positive, and that the only problem is that they're being stymied. Something out there, patriarchy, the state, colonialism, whatever you want to call it, is repressing. It's an expression-repression model, and it won't do. It certainly won't do since Freud, because we know from Freud and from other sources that one of the big problems is that whatever is repressing us is in here. It may also be up there, to be sure, but repression would never work. Political oppression would never work in the way that it does if it was simply external, and it would never work in the way in which it does unless it managed to persuade us somehow to love it, unless it managed to persuade us to hug our chains. That's the whole idea of hegemony, that not only do we submit to the law, but we delight in doing so, and we identify the law with our own identity, such that to violate the law will be to violate ourselves. Yes, there are good psychoanalytical reasons for believing that that is never entirely possible, and that, as it were, is the good news. But the bad news I'll leave to a personal conversation later, I think.
Terry, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. It's very rare to hear Madonna, Marx, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and all these different characters rolled into 40 minutes on the topic of materialism, nonetheless. And this book, of course, is part of a series of different books. You've written these sort of single title books on very dense topics. We have, of course, the German version of Materialism outside, but do you have more intended? The one before was Culture, I believe. Are there more intended in this series, taking on this very kind of courageous way, actually looking at tough subjects, giving it a singular title, and then analysing it nearly to death?
Yes, is the answer to that. I am producing a series of books, a kind of informal series. They all have one word in their title, like Culture and Materialism. And next year, you'll be delighted to hear, I can reveal to you now, here and now, at this very moment, uniquely, that I'll be publishing a book called Humour, which is, humour, of course, is an enormous academic industry, particularly in the United States. You may look at this, you can almost take a PhD in humour if you want. And it's about how humour operates, and why do we laugh, for example. The first chapter is called On Laughter, and its epigraph is from, I don't think you would know of him, but he was an English comedian now dead called Bob Monkhouse. And the epigraph is, they laughed when I said I wanted to be a comedian. Well, they're not laughing now. So it's generally a study of humour, and then after that, I've got a book on tragedy coming out, another book on tragedy, just to keep my readers genial and cheered up. I've also, part of my problem is I can't actually stop writing. I've seen therapists about this and looked for various devices that might help me, various contrascriptives, tablets you could take that stop you from writing. But it's no use. I've also written a book on death, which I toyed with the idea of bringing it out posthumously. My publishers weren't too keen on this matter, but I told them that you should add, if they did that, they should add a note saying the author rejects the charge that his recent death was a publicity stunt to promote the sales of this book, but I don't think they're going to go away with anything as irreverent as that.
Thank you, Terry. We have time for questions. We only have one microphone that works in the house, but Martina is going to go between myself and yourself, so any questions from the audience tonight? I remember in our last talk we had this long pause when it came to the question time, and I was going to wrap it up, you know, and say, okay, let's go out and have a drink. And then it was actually the artist actually handed Cheryl, and she said, no, just wait. Let the talk settle. Let them wait and see the question, and there you go.
Thank you. I hope my question doesn't sound very complex, but since I was the first one to take the initiative, bear with me, please. Marx starts explaining materialism by human beings being practical creatures, creative, with the power to transform. And then he goes to the theory of class struggle to attribute this power to a particular class, which is the oppressed one, which has the power to, you know, transform society by transforming itself. And given the complexity of today's world, how does the concept of materialism stand so side by side with the theory of class struggle? So because we see diversity even within a particular class, so who's the agent that carries this power to transform society? How do we understand materialism in today's complex world?
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent question. Oh, sorry. That's an excellent question, not too complicated at all. I think the missing term, perhaps, between materialism and class struggle is production, isn't it, or mode of production? Because for Marx, part of our material being, as I said, is the fact we have to labour. Yes, we have. For Marx, for Freud, desire means that we'll never be entirely at home in the world. There's something slightly tragic about the idea of desire. Marx suffers from being pre-Freudian in a certain way, but he does have the idea of lack. We have to labour to fill various lacks. We have needs, yes. And we have to do that not least in conditions of scarcity, yes, either natural scarcity or artificially engineered scarcity. Once one is producing in scarce situations, one tends for Marx to get the rise of classes. In other words, some people who, since not everybody can share in a great wealth, yes, then some people tend to corner or monopolize the means of production, a certain amount of wealth, and, you know, employ other people. So that for Marx, class struggle belongs to the era of material scarcity, but not natural scarcity, scarcity produced now by capitalism, for example, you know, artificially produced scarcity. As for the agency of that struggle, well, of course, everybody knows that Marx talks about the proletariat, but people don't perhaps realise sufficiently, unless they've read a brilliant book called Why Marx Was Right, written by me. They don't realise sufficiently that Marx didn't think that the proletariat was the same as the working class. Proletariat, by proletariat, he means basically what we call blue-collar workers, productive, mainly male, industrial workers. Now that class, of course, has dwindled globally, you know, at a huge scale, and you're referring to that. But Marx didn't think the proletariat was coextensive with the working class. He knew, for example, that in the society he lived in, namely Victorian England, the great majority of working class people were domestic servants. And of course, the great majority of those were women. The working class in Marx's day was mostly female. He stretched the proletariat simply, as it were, for functional reasons, namely, he thought the fact that they were massed together collectively in the way that domestic servants aren't, gave them a role to play in social transformation. Now that has to be rethought because, again, even the proletariat is no longer, in Marx's sense, is for the most part no longer physically massed together. Yeah. So there is indeed a diversity of agents, and there were also for Marx. You see, Marx talks about the way that the intelligentsia may become revolutionary, the way that students may, certain aspects of the petty bourgeoisie, and so on. Marx never concentrated solely on the working class. At the same time, and I'll promise to finish with this sentence, I just have to keep reminding people, I seem to be the only person that there's absolutely nothing whatsoever inherently positive about diversity. Yes, the postmodern mantra of plurality, diversity, heterogeneity, difference, and so on. Well, sometimes those things are positive politically, and sometimes they're not. I mean, I may be crazy, but I don't want to see a diversity of fascist parties. You know, one's quite enough. There's nothing in the concept of diversity which automatically puts it on the side of the angels. Marx goes out of his way to say that no mode of production in history has been as diverse, differential, hybrid, plural, multiple as capitalism, right? So that doesn't do, really, itself as a critique of the system. It depends on what kind of diversity you're thinking about and in what conditions. Anyway, any more questions?
Hello, good evening, and thank you so much for your insights. I was wondering, that's a very broad question, but what do you make up on the new technology developments such as artificial intelligence and human roboting, given that you've also talked about emotional assessment and yeah, basically the human as the creator, which now is being transferred into a machine or something non-human anymore.
Yeah. Well, I must begin by confessing that as far as technology goes, you're talking here to somebody who's never sent an email in his life. You know, I should be in a museum, really. I'm utterly freakish and unique. I never sent an email. I have no idea how to use the internet. You know, I'm extremely old. You know, I was young in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. You know, when we didn't have computers, didn't have anything. You know, you're not asking the right person. However, I just one comment about your very good point about artificial intelligence. And you see, everything I've said suggests, doesn't it, that our rationality, well, I said our rationality is an animal rationality. So how would you reproduce that kind of rationality in non-animal conditions, i.e. by machine? So certainly there are certain operations you can reproduce honestly, or do a lot better than human beings do. But I think that the tradition I'm talking about, the tradition, as it were, of the carnality of the cognitive, and you know, I think that has implications for information technology and artificial intelligence that we've not sufficiently thought through. Our thought isn't only a rationalist would imagine first that our mind is ours, yes? That our reason is ours. This tradition wouldn't think that at all, although it has a great respect for reason, but it would insist that reason always goes on within certain preconditions, which are not themselves a matter of reason, which is not to say that they're irrational either. Our problem is that without reason, we perish. Without reason, we've had it. Yeah? But reason doesn't go all the way down, as far as human beings are concerned. Reason is not the fundamental bedrock. And we have to cling on to both sides of that paradox, I think, to keep a perspective.
First, thank you for your really great words. I happened to meet your books by studying German literature aesthetics and illusions of postmodernism back in the days. And through your illusions of postmodernism, I came to reading Thomas Pynchon, his book V, the first one. And through studying from this book, I learned to know the term of entropy as a social term. I guess you know what it means in that kind of like everything blowing up like a balloon, but there must be, sooner or later, there must be an end, like in natural sciences, where that term also exists. It means like a planet becoming a red big one, little, you know, the genesis of planets. Have you got any idea? I know science is describing, but have you got an idea about the future, especially now? Because for me it seems like I don't know the word of that great book from Paul Virilio. In German it's Rasender Stillstand. Maybe you could translate. Paul Virilio, his book Rasender Stillstand, it means like outrageous status quo, more or less. Have you got any prospects for us, for me, for you?
Well, I don't know much about this, but ignorance has never deterred me from anything. So I'll just try and wing it. In terms of the future, I was talking about the Hebrew scriptures. One interesting thing about the prophet, yes, in the Hebrew scriptures, is he's not, they're all male, he's not really a clairvoyant in the sense of somebody whose job is to foretell the future. One of the reasons why you can't make a graven image of Yahweh is not only because, as I said, the only image of Yahweh is us, is people, human flesh and blood, but because Yahweh is the God of the future. I shall be who I shall be, he says. And trying to make a graven image of God is trying to control and determine the future in a sort of blueprinting, utopian kind of way. Now, Marx is a secular Jew in all kinds of ways, really. But one way in which he is that he has very little interest in utopian blueprints. In fact, he starts his career in contention with utopian thought. Marxism, he thinks that's a sort of distraction. For a leftist, I think the only image of the future is the failure of the present. It's a negative image. The moment you begin to put too much affirmativeness into that, then you end up, your image of the future is inevitably an extrapolation from where you are now. You can't, if we could speak the language of the future, we'd be there already. Yes. The question for Marx is how we get from where we are now to where we are then, to where we'll be then. And once we have, for him, radicalism has no further purpose whatsoever to play. There will be no feminism in a society beyond patriarchy. As long as there are feminists and socialists around, it's a very poor outlook. It's a great pity that they're around. Why? Because because part of their realizing their goals would be that they would no longer be necessary. So any radical project must be self-abolishing. You mustn't try and cling on. Being a radical is not like being a Jew or a Buddhist. It's very different. Now, just to go back finally to your point about the future and the end, let me just say a quick word about apocalypse. A state within the natural world that we're actually able to destroy ourselves collectively. And that point is, of course, a specific historical point in time where that comes about. We could name that, we could put a pin in that, as it were. So, one has the extraordinary sudden readjustment of perspectives, which is that apocalypse is us. That if we don't look out, we are the agent of the apocalypse, not simply the suffering victims, as almost the whole of the apocalyptic tradition has imagined.
I have a question question on the concept of radicalism. So in political science, we've been discussing it a lot, and it's like in different countries, politically radicalism, it means something different in each particular political context. So I was wondering if, concepts are important. As, Rancière writes in The Disagreement, if we understand one word differently, we're not going to understand each other, so we will be talking about two different things. I was wondering whether people who think of themselves as Marxist should also embrace this term radical, or do you think this is maybe out of the discourse and it's not healthy anymore, or we should like bring it to the political discourse again? Because I'm kind of confused on this.
I'm trying to confuse you a little more, if I may. Actually, Marx has a comment on this, strangely. He says, I don't know where it is, he says at some point, radicalism is of the root, which of course is etymologically what radical means. And he says, and the root is humanity. I can't remember exactly what context he says that in, but he does have a comment on radicalism. There was a point, wasn't there, some years ago, when suddenly the word radicalism was appropriated for terrorism. It had previously largely been used to the left, not entirely, but largely, and suddenly the real radicals now were terrorists. Radicalism became, as it were, an utterly destructive force. One of the, if you think of, this is a different story, but I mean, if you think of the great heights of 20th century modernism, in all of the, right across the arts, because of course modernism goes right not only across all countries almost, but across the arts in general. The typical modernist is a nomad, wandering from state to state, crossing frontiers between art forms, languages, and so on. Most, you might say, certainly an enormous number of the really impressive, if you like the word great, whatever that means, modernist artists are radicals, but they are radicals of the right and not of the left. Modernism emerges not from mainstream, liberal, middle-class, suburban, democratic society. It emerges from people like Yeats and T.S. Eliot and others whose politics are really very, very much of the right. It's as though there is the critique of bourgeois society, which could have been produced by the left under different conditions, is actually hijacked by the right. Yes. And one of the two of the major exceptions to that are fellow countrymen of our chairperson here, and indeed myself. That's Joyce and Beckett. Yes. Beckett, who fights fascism literally, who's a guerrilla fighter against fascism, is awarded the Croix for that, and James Joyce, who always, early on was a socialist and later was certainly a Democrat and a liberal, but an alarming amount of modernism comes straight out of the far right and sometimes quasi-fascist right. And therefore, and I think actually that we don't therefore say, oh, great art, what a pity about the politics. I think in a curious way, the two are related. But in order to develop that, if you approach me privately and for a very modest fee, I'll let you know my thoughts about that.
You started your talk with the distinction between what you called Hollywood spirituality and the Judeo-Christian tradition, and then brought it to materialism. What about, or my question is, what about the pagan, the Greek and Roman traditions of materialism? For example, Marx started his career with his dissertation on Democrit and Epicurus or Lucretius. So, what do you think about how is this related to the start or the beginning you made?
Yes. That's a very good question, very interesting question. I don't know what the later Marx would have made of his earlier, kind of doctoral self when he wrote his doctoral thesis precisely on what you might call materialist philosophy. See, because there's a sense in which that for the later Marx is almost a contradiction in terms. Materialist philosophy being, as I said, something seeming itself as autonomous of material conditions. So the materialist philosophy, in a sense, for Marx, is technically an oxymoron. The oxymoron is a self-contradictory phrase, like, for example, business ethics. That's an oxymoron, right? Or the famous oxymoron, military intelligence. Now, because I think that what happens with Marx, it's a very good point that he does indeed begin with, as it were, philosophical materialism, but I think he wants to move materialism away from a philosophical basis. In other words, he does not want to be what you might call a metaphysical materialist. He's not interested in the question, what are things made of? Are they made of Geist? Or are they made of matter? Or no? Marx has a very impatient and brisk way with very abstract questions. That's a point to remember, by the way. In one sense, no, this is slightly diverging from your theme, Marx is a good old romantic humanist. He is committed to the concrete and the sensuous and the particular. And he thinks that we need abstract concepts, but only to be able to explicate those things more fully. Yes? And he's a bit suspicious, therefore, of metaphysical thought. I think perhaps too much. I think there's a place. One shouldn't be frightened by the word metaphysical. There's a place for that. But he's sort of moving away from, if you like, philosophical materialism into, I suppose, what eventually is called historical materialism. But he has first, in his early work, to move into this concept of the material as the corporeal agent, and then look at the implications of that. I'd be delighted to sign books for a very small fee from having extra to your buying the book. Thank you very much.